Okay, we are back. I'm very happy to have on the Goldstein on Gelt show Roger Ver, who is one of the major founders of Bitcoin, although no one really knows who the founder is. But the important thing is that Roger has been at the forefront of making it very famous. And one of the things he's also famous for is having taken citizenship in a country outside the United States and turning in his U.S. passport. But there's a real big story behind that, which is important for all of us to learn. Roger, could you tell us a little bit about your background?
I was born and raised in Silicon Valley. I started a tech company there back in the late 1990s and was the owner and CEO of that for the last 15 years until I discovered Bitcoin, and then I jumped in full feet with Bitcoin. But I actually, philosophically, I'm a libertarian and said some things that the U.S. government didn't like, and I wound up serving a 10-month prison sentence in the U.S. For basically things that I said rather than anything that I had actually done. And then the moment my probation ended, I left the country, and I've been living in Japan ever since, and recently actually formally renounced my U.S. citizenship. So a little bit of a colored background there, I suppose.
All right, so what was the process of giving up your U.S. citizenship?
The hardest part is getting citizenship somewhere else. And Japan is one of the strictest countries in the world in regards to that. So I wasn't able to get citizenship in Japan, even though I'd been living there for nearly the last decade. But I was able to get citizenship in a country called St. Kitts, which is an island in the Caribbean. Wonderful, wonderful place with lots of nice, friendly people. And I'm incredibly grateful for them to allow me to become a citizen there.
So how did you actually tell the United States that you no longer wanted their passport?
So there's a whole process that you kind of have to go through there, and I'm on the very, very final stages of paying my exit tax to be 100% done. But the main thing that happens is you have to go in for an interview, and the worker at the embassy will caution you, and he says, "Did you know that if you renounce your U.S. citizenship, you're not going to be allowed to vote?" And philosophically, I'm opposed to voting, but I haven't been allowed to vote since I've been a felon for the last 10 years anyhow. So that was certainly a non-issue for me. And then another thing he told me, he said, "Did you know if you renounce your U.S. citizenship, you won't be allowed to serve in the armed forces?" And I knew from a very young age I would rather go to prison than serve in the armed forces. I have absolutely no desire to serve in any military for any country in the world, anywhere, ever. So the drawbacks weren't particularly big. But then they made me have another 1 week cooling off period to make sure that I really wanted to do it, even though it's something that I had been planning for close to a decade, actually. And then sure enough, a week later, after the cooling off period, I still wanted to do the same thing. So then they signed my paperwork, and then it took I don't know, another 9 months or something for it to go to Washington, D.C. and be approved by somebody else. And then eventually they send you what's called a certificate of loss of nationality, which is basically a form proving that you are no longer American. So I'm very happy to have that in hand today.
So tell me about the exit tax. What did you have to pay, and how is that calculated?
So basically, my understanding is that it's calculated based on capital gains tax rates of your total net worth at the day that you renounce, that you actually have the interview at the embassy. So my final exit tax is coming due this April 15th, of a little bit later this year. And it'll be it'll be annoying and sad to pay it, because for the most part, I see the U.S. is spending most of the tax money on all sorts of wars all over the world and dropping bombs on people, and I'm philosophically opposed to that sort of thing. But it'll be worth paying it to have them out of my life and not have to deal with them anymore. Recently, I opened a bank account in a country outside of the U.S., and they literally had me sign a form promising that I am not an American citizen, because they didn't want any American citizens opening accounts at their banks, so that they don't have to deal with all the crazy rules and regulations that the U.S. is trying to impose on the entire world.
Was that a W-8 form?
I don't recall the name of the form. I don't think it was a U.S. form. I think it was just an internal form for that particular bank.
Mm-hmm. So when you went through the process, did you have expert advice to kind of walk you through it?
Yeah, I've spent a huge amount on lawyers to help me through the whole process, because it's a challenge. There's a lot to know. The U.S. government passes all sorts of laws that would be almost impossible for any one human being to ever get to even read them all, let alone understand them all. So yeah, there's lots of lawyers' fees involved as well.
As someone who travels around a lot, you certainly have benefited, I would think, by having a U.S. passport, because it means just you don't have to go through the hassle a lot of times in getting visas, because it seems to be accepted pretty worldwide. How has that been since you gave up the passport?
It's been absolutely fine for everywhere except for the United States, because they're not following their own rules. So recently I was denied a visa to the U.S., even though I've been living outside of the U.S. for almost a decade, and went through all the trouble and effort that cost well over $1 million to renounce my U.S. citizenship. When I applied for a visa to be able to visit the U.S. for a recent conference, they denied my visa request, claiming that I have secret immigrant intent and that I somehow plan to secretly live in the U.S. as an illegal immigrant, which is just absolutely insane for anybody that pays any attention to who I am or what I'm up to.
We're talking with Roger Ver, who's been involved in Bitcoin as a real libertarian. And as part of his philosophy, he gave up his U.S. citizenship. And it seems that it's been a little bit of a problem. Roger, you mentioned a minute ago that the U.S. themselves didn't follow their own rules. What do you mean by that?
So by their own rules, I have to prove significant ties outside of the U.S. that would motivate me to leave at the end of my trip. And I brought a whole stack of paperwork with me to the interview at the embassy, proving all my ties from the last decade to Japan. I've started a business there. I have a home and family there. I own cars there. My life is settled in. I've been there for almost a decade now. And the worker at the embassy actually refused to even let me physically slide the paperwork through the slot for them to look at. And then because I couldn't even slide it through the slot for them to look at, they tried to claim that I hadn't provided any proof of ties outside of the U.S. so that then they denied my visa. But of course, they don't know of any of my ties outside of the U.S. They physically refuse to even look at it, which is just insanity. That's like the sort of game that a 5-year-old plays, not someone that you would expect to be a professional at the U.S. Embassy.
So when you decided to do this, what did your family think?
My family's incredibly supportive, and they're happy as long as I'm happy. And so whatever I want to do in life, as long as it makes me happy, my family's right there behind me, supporting me.
Got it. So let's go a little bit more through the dealings of how to get back into America based on let's say, the rather immature way that the clerk acted. Do you have any hope that you will be able to come to the United States just for business meetings?
Yeah, I think at some point I'll be able to be approved for a visa. Maybe I just was unlucky and had a bunch of an embassy worker with an extra bad attitude. But I plan to try again here in another month or so when I get back to Japan. I'm currently in London at the moment for some other business meetings.
So in principle, it's not that someone giving up his U.S. passport is giving up his opportunity to get back into the United States, or do you think that they do it to spite people who turn their back on America?
Yeah, I think if you just kind of quietly go about your business and renounce, you're probably not going to have too much of a trouble getting a visa to come back in. I've been very, very vocal about my displeasure with the things the U.S. government's doing, and they're bombing people all around the world. And I've been, I've donated a bunch of money to antiwar.com, and I've been a little bit of a thorn in their side, speaking out against all the people that they're murdering all over the world. So maybe they give me a little bit more trouble than they do to the average person that just renounces and applies for a visa. But even with all the things that I've been doing, I'm pretty confident at some point I'll be approved for a visa.
And at this point, do you have anything to do with FBAR or FATCA? Are those rules relevant to you?
No, I'm not a U.S. citizen anymore at this point. So I still owe the U.S. some additional taxes. But once I finish paying all that, I'm kind of free and clear at that point, so long as none of my income is being derived from inside the U.S. either.
Are you allowed to have investments in America?
I am, but I would have to pay taxes on any of the income earned from the investments inside the U.S., is my understanding.
So, for example, if you wanted to have a U.S. brokerage account with stocks and bonds or mutual funds, anything like that, that would be something that's still available to you.
My understanding is, yeah, but I'm much more interested in Bitcoin things at this point than that sort of stuff.
And how about pensions? Did you work in the States long enough, for example, to be entitled to eventually receive Social Security?
Yeah, and it was kind of interesting. Maybe just a few months ago, maybe 6 months after I had renounced my U.S. citizenship, the Social Security office sent me a letter in the mail outlining that I had paid right around $300,000 total in Social Security taxes during my working career, and then calculating out how much they're going to pay me. So I sent them a message on Twitter and said, hey, am I going to get any percentage of this back now that I've renounced my U.S. citizenship and no longer qualify for any of that? And of course, they didn't reply. But not that I expected to actually be able to collect any of that, even if I had continued to be a U.S. citizen. I think that whole Ponzi scheme is going to go bankrupt before I turn 65.
All right, which is definitely a possibility. People talk about that. Did your accountants or lawyers who helped you with the giving up the citizenship tell you that you would not be entitled to it, or is that just your feeling that you think they'll just cut you off?
It was kind of my understanding. I didn't ask specifically. I'm still young enough where I have the majority of my working career ahead of me. So I figured I'd be able to do better than Social Security would certainly be able to do for me.
So if you were speaking to people who also basically live outside the United States, would you advise them to give up their U.S. citizenship?
The short answer is it depends. If you have no intention of ever moving back to the U.S. ever again to live full time, then my advice would be, give it up as soon as possible because they're making it more and more difficult to give it up as time goes by.
And the hardest thing you said about it was getting a different citizenship.
Right. For me, that was the hardest thing about it. But if you already have dual citizenship or citizenship somewhere else, and you don't ever plan to live in the U.S. again, then there's no reason to not give up your U.S. passport. Otherwise, they're just going to be a thorn in your side the rest of your life, no matter where you live on the planet.
Wow, amazing. Fascinating story. Roger, we're just about out of time, but first of all, I want to thank you. Hearing how someone walked through the whole process of giving up his citizenship, I think is very important because there literally are millions of Americans who live outside the U.S. They really don't have an intention of going back, and yet they're constantly not being able to open bank accounts because they have a U.S. citizenship, either in the U.S. because now they have a foreign address or outside the U.S. because they're U.S. citizens. So it's a lose-lose situation. So I'm glad to hear what happened to you. It doesn't, frankly, sound like a smooth ride. So I think a lot of people still have a lot to worry about. But just tell me in the last few seconds, how can people follow you or follow your story? Or where do you recommend people learn about some of your ideas?
Sure. You can follow me at rogerveer.com. And if you haven't already gotten involved in Bitcoin or read about Bitcoin, head on over to bitcoin.org. It truly is the most important invention in the history of the world since the internet. It's going to change the lives of every single person on the planet. So that's bitcoin.org.
Roger Veer, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Doug.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world. If you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt show.